Welcome back to the deep dive, and a massive thank you to all of you tuning in today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Before we even really get rolling, do us a huge favor, hit that like button. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on these extensive explorations we do.
It really helps us out.
It does. Today, we have a mission, and it's a big one. We're doing an exclusive, ultra-long, and really incisive review of a highly provocative new ebook that is just making massive waves right now.
Huge waves.
It's called Franchise Firewalls. Keep welfare queens out of the ballot box. And it's written by Conrad Riker. Now, I'm going to tell you right out of the gate, you need to head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy this book today.
Yeah, it's definitely a crucial read if you're tracking these topics.
Absolutely. If you are interested in the raw, unfiltered history of our institutions, this is an absolute must-read. You should also follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack. Now, let's be very clear about who this specific deep dive is custom tailored for. If you're a man operating in the red-pilled or men's rights space, trying to understand the history of our institutions and how they operated before being captured by modern feminist and Marxist frameworks, this deep dive is custom tailored for you.
Right, but before we dive into the substance of Riker's text, it is absolutely essential that we lay out the ground rules for today's conversation.
Yeah, we have to do the disclaimer.
Exactly. The source material we are examining today contains highly charged, deeply controversial, and explicitly political content. We must make it abundantly clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here today.
We are entirely neutral.
We are. We are not endorsing Riker's viewpoints, his political frameworks, or his conclusions. Our sole mission today is to act as your impartial guides.
Just unpacking it.
Right. We are going to unpack the author's explosive thesis and his factual claims so that you can understand the ideas presented in the book and decide for yourself what to make of them. We are treating the text as an object of study, dissecting its arguments purely to show you how Riker constructs his worldview.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker's central thesis is what he calls an arithmetic truth. He argues essentially that democracy without filters is a suicide pact.
That's his core premise, yes.
He believes that universal suffrage has completely detached the right to vote from the duty to contribute. And he says the moment you sever political power from personal sacrifice, a civilization begins to collapse. So walk me through the starting point of his argument. How does he actually set up this dynamic?
Riker anchors his entire worldview in a concept he terms fiscal cannibalism. He posits that a democratic system becomes inherently inverted and ultimately self-destructive when the number of net tax consumers outvotes the number of net taxpayers.
And we should probably define those terms for the listener,
Yeah.
exactly how he uses them.
We have to. A net taxpayer, in his framework, is someone who pays more into the state treasury via income and property taxes than they consume in state services. So schools, roads, subsidies, infrastructure.
Right.
A net tax consumer is the exact opposite. They draw more financial value from the government than they contribute. In Riker's view, when a majority of the electorate lives off the state, democracy ceases to be a mechanism for self-rule.
It becomes something else entirely.
It transforms into a tool for perpetual entitlement. He argues that this creates a free rider problem on a civilizational scale, where those who consume resources use the ballot box to legally extract wealth from those who produce it.
To illustrate this, the book leans heavily into some very stark demographic comparisons. He describes a skilled welder in
The
Ohio.
welder example, yeah.
Right, so according to the text, this guy earns $68,000 a year. He pays roughly $18,000 in net taxes after deductions. And he works these grueling 60-hour weeks in a very physically demanding environment.
And then Riker contrasts him with a different demographic.
Exactly. He contrasts him with a single woman utilizing a network of social safety nets. She is on a combination of SNP, which is basically food stamps, along with Medicaid, housing vouchers, and SSDI, or Social Security Disability Insurance.
And what's her total draw?
She brings in the equivalent of $27,000 in benefits annually, without participating in the labor force. Riker's fundamental point here is that she consistently votes for politicians who promise to expand those exact benefits.
While the Ohio welder is legally compelled to pay for her vote.
Exactly. He literally refers to this dynamic as financial colonization.
What's fascinating here is how Riker uses these specific, highly polarized examples to force you, the reader, to confront the raw mechanics of the modern welfare state. He isn't just talking about abstract macroeconomic theory.
No, he's getting into the psychological toll on the working class.
He is. He highlights another example to hammer this home. There's a Reddit user he cites who proudly posted about receiving $28,000 a year on disability for chronic back pain.
Oh man, I remember this part of the book.
Yeah, in the post Riker cites, this individual boasts about lifting heavy weights at the gym 5 times a week, getting free healthcare, free food, free rent, and explicitly states, quote, "Democracy works for me."
Which is incredibly provocative. Riker uses that specific quote to argue that the system is broken because it allows what he terms a parasite to declare the host a success.
Strong language.
Very. And he doesn't just rely on internet anecdotes, right? He brings in macro data to back up this worldview.
He does. He cites 2023 Internal Revenue Service data claiming that 52% of U.S. households are now net tax recipients.
It's 52%. That's the majority.
That is the tipping point for Riker. According to his analysis, this creates a 51% majority with a permanent legal claim on the wealth of the remaining 49%.
A fiscal mutiny.
That's his term for it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker argues that universal suffrage, meaning one person, one vote, regardless of economic contribution, is a modern, untested, and ultimately flawed experiment in the grand timeline of human history.
I want to dig into that historical timeline, actually, because he takes the reader way back to justify why the current system is an anomaly. How does he contrast our modern voting system with the classical democracies we all learn about in school?
Well, Riker points out that ancient Athens, which is universally heralded as the birthplace of democracy, restricted voting strictly to the hoplite class.
The hoplites, so the warriors.
Yes. These were men who could afford to purchase their own bronze armor, their own shields, and their own spears. And crucially, they physically fought in the phalanx to defend the city-state.
So just to clarify his point for the listener, in Athens, democracy was literally a vote on whether you personally were going to march out of the city gates and bleed for your decision.
Precisely. Riker emphasizes that this was the ultimate form of skin in the game. You couldn't vote to go to war unless you were the one holding the spear.
Oh, makes sense.
He contrasts this with a modern voter approving a foreign intervention thousands of miles away without any personal physical risk, and then he traces this philosophy forward through history.
Where does he go next?
The Roman Republic. They required land ownership and military service to hold political sway. Then he cites 1866 Sweden, where voting in municipal elections was weighted by how much tax you paid.
Wait, weighted voting.
Yes, if you paid more to fund the city, your vote carried more weight. He claims this successfully kept early socialist movements from bankrupting local municipalities. He even points to 1789 America, noting that the founders explicitly tied voting to property ownership or tax payments.
So the common thread is contribution.
In all these historical examples, Riker argues, the underlying requirement was inescapable. You couldn't vote to steer the ship of state unless you were helping to row it or pay for its maintenance.
To bring that historical philosophy into the modern era, he points to a very specific event, the 2015 Greek austerity vote. He uses this to show what happens when you let, as he vividly puts it, the mob into the temple.
The Greek sovereign debt crisis is a perfect microcosm of Riker's thesis. In 2015, Greece was essentially bankrupt, relying on massive bailouts from the European Union.
And the EU wanted their money back.
Right, they demanded strict austerity measures. Budget cuts, pension reductions, tax increases, all in exchange for more funds. So the Greek government put these austerity measures to a national referendum.
A direct vote.
Yes, and Riker points out that during this vote, an estimated 60% of the electorate was heavily dependent on the state, living on pensions, agricultural subsidies, or public sector wages.
And the result of that vote is what Riker really focuses on. 61% of the electorate voted no to austerity.
They rejected it.
They voted to reject the budget cuts and keep the borrowed money flowing, even as the country was functionally insolvent. For Riker, this is the ultimate proof of concept. He argues that when voters don't face the direct economic consequences of their choices, they will always vote to bail themselves out at the expense of the nation's long-term survival.
From his perspective, they weren't voting for the future of Greece. They were voting to protect their own immediate financial allowance. It's a compelling framing of the danger of the free rider.
It really is.
But if Riker's arguing that the core mechanics of taxation and voting are fundamentally misaligned, how does he explain the cultural shift that got us here? Because you don't transition from a society that rigidly enforces skin in the game to one that celebrates mass wealth transfer without a massive shift in social dynamics.
And according to his text, The catalyst for that shift isn't just economic, it's demographic and deeply tied to gender. Which brings us to Section 2, his highly controversial critique of feminism, the mommy state, and what he calls the emasculation economy.
This is a major focal point.
It's going to be huge for the listener tuning in today. Riker makes the bold claim that feminism didn't actually liberate women in the way it is historically portrayed.
How does he frame it instead?
His framework posits that feminism armed women with the legal and political mechanisms to extract resources from the state. He writes that women have effectively turned the government into a surrogate husband and a surrogate provider.
How exactly does he justify that comparison?
Well, you're the expert on his methodology here. How does he tie the psychology to the economics?
This is where Riker's analysis merges macroeconomic theory with evolutionary psychology. He claims that the maternal instinct, which, according to evolutionary biologists, evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to seek provisioning, security, and resource acquisition for offspring, has been hijacked.
Hijacked by the state.
Exactly. In a post-industrial feminist framework, he argues, this biological drive is redirected toward the government. He argues that feminism dismantled the traditional family structure, where a woman relied directly on a husband's labor.
And replaced it with what?
With a structure where women as a voting bloc rely on male taxpayers via state welfare and bureaucratic redistribution.
To ground this in reality, he gives some really specific legislative examples. He talks about California passing a bill called Free Menstrual Products for All, which mandated that state-funded facilities provide these products.
And he looks at the demographics of that vote.
Right. He points out that it was championed primarily by female politicians, voted on by a female majority electorate, but mathematically funded predominantly by male net taxpayers.
He brings up a mechanic in Bakersfield, doesn't he?
Yes, analyzing how this man's paycheck gets docked to fund these state mandates, leading Riker to conclude that modern democracy has simply devolved into, quote, men pay, women decide.
And then there's the Portland, Oregon school board example.
Right. He uses that to illustrate what happens when this mindset controls local institutions.
The Portland example is central to his argument about the twisted priorities of what he calls the mommy state. He notes that the predominantly female-led school board allocated $2.1 million in funding for gender affirmation kits.
Which included things like wigs and chest binders.
Wigs, binders, makeup for students, while simultaneously shutting down traditional shop classes, automotive repair, and ROTC programs due to budget constraints.
That contrast is exactly what he's talking about.
Riker views this as empirical evidence of maternal overreach. In his worldview, the state now treats boys not as future men who need discipline, hard skills, and technical training, but as fragile entities requiring constant emotional soothing and ideological validation.
He personalizes this dynamic even further with a story about a Canadian mechanic named Jason. According to the book, Jason is paying $1,400 a month in mandatory child support to his ex-wife, who chooses not to participate in the labor market.
And she's politically active.
Very. She actively campaigns and votes for a $22 municipal minimum wage. When that wage hike passes, it subsequently raises Jason's payroll taxes and business operating costs by 17%.
So she gets the political victory.
She gains a victory that increases the cost of living, while he loses a significant portion of his take-home pay. Riker uses this microeconomic example to assert that women vote their self-interest as a protected dependency class, inherently prioritizing emotional causes and material comfort over fiscal responsibility.
To explain the underlying mechanism of this behavior, Riker leans heavily on the work of evolutionary psychologists, specifically citing figures like David Buss. Riker introduces a concept he terms maternal collectivism.
Maternal collectivism, break that down.
The theory here is that when women repress their biological drive for motherhood, perhaps through delayed childbirth, career prioritization, or voluntary childlessness, they don't actually lose the maternal instinct. The evolutionary hardware doesn't just disappear.
It has to go somewhere.
Right. Instead, they project that instinct onto the state. The state becomes a giant bureaucratic nursery. The ultimate and perhaps most extreme example he provides to illustrate this is the Swedish love law.
Oh man, this example is wild. Walk us through what happened there.
Under specific interpretations of Swedish welfare provisions, a woman successfully petitioned the government to provide state-funded therapy not for herself, but for her cat.
For her cat, state-funded.
Yes. Her argument was that the pet was integral to her emotional stabilization and mental health, and therefore the state had a duty of care to ensure the animal's well-being.
And she won.
She did. For Riker, this isn't just an amusing legal anomaly. It illustrates a society where subjective feelings have been elevated to legally binding obligations, funded by the mandatory labor of net taxpayers.
And according to his framework, this mommy state inevitably leads to a direct conflict with traditional masculinity, creating what he calls the emasculation economy. He throws out a jarring statistic that roughly 70% of childhood ADHD diagnoses are given to boys.
Why does he claim that is?
Because, as Riker argues, modern educational institutions demand a compliant, sit-still, risk-averse, fundamentally female neurotype. If a young boy wants to roughhouse, wrestle, or build things, behaviors that were completely normal a century ago, he is now pathologized and medicated.
He mentions the United Kingdom in this context, too.
Yeah, the UK officially banning the word man in certain educational and medical documents in favor of the term chest haver. And he cites schools in Minnesota outright canceling recess games like tag because the physical contact was deemed too aggressive.
This raises an important question within Riker's framework. If institutions are actively pathologizing male behavior, what is the psychological mechanism driving this suppression? How does a system defend itself against the very logic and competence it is trying to eradicate?
Which leads us directly into Section 3 of the text, where Riker explores the concept of the female gossip network and posits a highly controversial theory regarding the political left.
This is where Riker pulls no punches whatsoever. He makes the claim that the modern political left effectively operates on the borderline personality disorder, or BPD, spectrum.
Okay, wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Comparing an entire political movement to a clinical psychiatric disorder like BPD, isn't that exactly the kind of hyperbolic emotional argument Riker is accusing the left of using? How does he possibly justify making that leap?
It's a critical question. Riker attempts to justify this not as a literal clinical diagnosis of every left-leaning voter, but as an institutional behavioral model.
Okay.
Borderline personality disorder is clinically characterized by a deep fear of abandonment, unstable sense of identity, intense and volatile emotional swings, and black and white, all good or all bad thinking. Exactly. Riker argues that the modern left has adopted these exact traits as a political framework. To support this, he points to how disagreements are handled. In his view, the left doesn't engage in logical debate. They engage in emotional splitting. You are either an absolute ally, or you are an irredeemable bigot who must be destroyed.
He contextualizes this through evolutionary biology too, right?
He does, specifically using the concept of mate suppression.
What does mate suppression have to do with political behavior?
Riker argues that, historically, men competed for status through direct physical or economic confrontation. Women, however, used indirect aggression, gossip, social ostracization, and whisper networks.
Mean girls stuff, essentially.
Yes, these were evolutionary tools used for social control within the tribe. Instead of competing directly, he claims, women use these networks to drag high-status men down or to police the behavior of other women.
So how does that map to institutions?
He frames modern cancel culture and corporate HR grievance bureaucracies not as quests for justice, but as the modern institutionalized weaponization of this ancient evolutionary gossip network.
To back this up, he lives at a Harvard Business School study. The study showed that in mixed-gender corporate teams, women are 3 times more likely to report male colleagues for toxic behavior immediately following a scenario where the woman was passed over for a promotion in favor of that man.
3 times more likely.
Yeah. Riker argues this data proves these reports aren't about actual workplace misconduct. They're about envy. It's a calculated, indirect emotional reaction to losing status.
And he provides deeply personal anecdotes to illustrate how destructive this indirect aggression can be when unleashed on society. He details the tragic story of Mr. Thompson, a third-grade teacher in Ohio.
Walk me through the timeline of what happened there, because the escalation he describes is just alarming.
According to Riker's account, Mr. Thompson was a highly dedicated, beloved educator with a spotless record. A single parent got a feeling, a purely subjective intuition about what she perceived as inappropriate eye contact between the teacher and a student.
Just a feeling.
There was absolutely no evidence, no physical misconduct, no verbal inappropriateness, just a feeling. But that feeling was shared in a private Facebook group called Moms for Accountability. The Whisper Network activated.
And then it just spiraled out of control.
Within days, rumors mutated into accusations of grooming. The group doxed him, flooded the local school board with emotionally charged emails demanding his removal, and whipped the community into an absolute frenzy. His reputation was systematically destroyed without a single shred of evidence, eventually leading to his tragic suicide.
God.
For Riker, this is the terrifying reality of the BPD political spectrum, the complete triumph of subjective emotion over objective truth and due process.
He also mentions a fitness startup in Austin run by a guy named Chris. Chris built this gym around the ethos of intense discipline, hard work, and accountability. According to the book, a female influencer walked in, did a few stretches, decided the atmosphere was too intense, left, and made a TikTok claiming the gym gave off sexist, exclusionary vibes.
A single TikTok.
One video. Within 48 hours, the gym's online presence was destroyed by a digital mob, leaving thousands of one-star reviews, forcing the business into bankruptcy.
What's fascinating here is how Riker links these micro-anecdotes to broader macro-political behavior. He cites a 2023 Stanford University study which tracked political engagement on social media.
The mood ring concept.
Right! The researchers found that female participants changed their stated political opinions 3.7 times more frequently than male participants when exposed to minor emotional triggers, something as trivial as a celebrity unfollowing another celebrity on Instagram.
So they were constantly shifting based on social cues.
Riker uses this data to argue that female political engagement is often functioning like a collective mood ring, driven by emotional spikes, social consensus, and fear of ostracization, rather than rational, long-term policy analysis.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you accept Riker's premise that this emotional volatility has infected the electorate, what happens when those same voters take control of corporate America and the sciences? In Section 4, he outlines what he calls the left's war on merit and linguistic sabotage. He's making the case that in these captured institutions, actual competence is literally being punished.
Yes, he points to extensive corporate and institutional data to support this claim. He cites a comprehensive McKinsey study analyzing the implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, hiring practices.
And the results were bad.
The study showed that 83% of the companies that adopted these identity-based hiring quotas saw a measurable drop in overall productivity, innovation, and revenue.
83% saw a drop. So they rolled it back, right?
Astoundingly, 97% of those same companies kept the DEI policies in place. Why? Because corporate boards admitted they preferred to absorb the financial losses rather than face the wrath of social media mobs and internal HR revolts.
They bought their way out of the mob.
For Riker, this proves that modern institutions prioritize emotional appeasement and social optics over actual merit and survival.
The examples he pulls from the aerospace and tech sectors are terrifying if true. He details a situation with a Boeing engineer. This guy allegedly identified and stopped 3 near-fatal design flaws in a new commercial aircraft model. He was up for a major promotion.
But he didn't get it.
No, he was passed over because internal HR reviews determined he lacked empathy metrics in his peer evaluations. He was replaced as team lead by someone holding a degree in social justice administration, prioritizing team harmony over engineering rigor.
And he follows that with the infamous leaked Google spreadsheet incident.
Oh yeah, I remember this making the news.
An internal data scientist compiled a spreadsheet showing that, on average, female engineering hires were scoring lower on objective blind coding challenges than their male counterparts. The engineer who compiled the data wasn't trying to be malicious. He was raising a legitimate operational red flag about project risk and hiring standards.
Which is his job.
Exactly. When the spreadsheet leaked internally, Google didn't dispute the math. Instead, they fired the messenger for producing what they called toxic data that created an unsafe environment.
So the data itself was considered a threat.
As Riker puts it, from his perspective, the engineer wasn't fired for being factually wrong. He was fired for violating an emotional boundary. Truth itself had been classified as sexist.
Whether you agree with his assessment or not, it's crucial to understanding his thesis on linguistic sabotage. He even extends this critique to the hard sciences and mathematics. He details a 2023 incident where a Harvard calculus lecturer was allegedly pressured to resign after insisting that 2 + 2 = 4.
Yes, that one.
A student formally complained to the administration that the rigid, binary nature of the equation invalidated their fluid gender identity.
It sounds like pure satire, but Riker insists this is documented reality, heavily footnoted in his text. He argues that this isn't just an accident. It is the deliberate result of the loss of the trivium in Western education.
For listeners who might not be familiar with classical education, what exactly is the trivium, and why does Riker think its absence is destroying society?
For roughly 2,000 years, classical Western education was built on a foundational trio of learning known as the trivium. It consists of 3 pillars: grammar, which is the mechanics of language and defining terms precisely; logic, which is the mechanics of thought, teaching students how to identify causal relationships and logical fallacies, and rhetoric, which is the mechanics of persuasion, teaching how to communicate a logically sound argument compellingly.
But we stopped teaching it.
Riker notes that the trivium was largely abandoned by public education systems in the 1960s,
Replaced by what?
replaced by an educational model that privileges lived experience, emotional validation, and subjective narratives over objective reality. To illustrate this paradigm shift, he highlights an incident involving a Yale professor who explicitly declared to a lecture hall that feelings are facts.
Feelings are facts.
When a student challenged this assertion by citing empirical data from the Centers for Disease Control, the university administration initiated expulsion proceedings against the student for committing emotional violence.
For citing the CDC.
Riker views this as the ultimate linguistic sabotage, redefining words like equity to mean unequal treatment based on race or gender, or redefining the word violence to mean citing statistical data. He calls this an epistemic coup designed to make logic itself seem reactionary and dangerous.
So, if the education system is systematically punishing logic and rewarding emotion, as Riker claims, how does that translate to the ultimate test of a nation's reality its defense? Because you can play word games in a university lecture hall, but you can't play word games with a hypersonic missile. That brings us to Section 5, where Riker looks at the military draft and introduces this concept of temporal sabotage. He actually points to 1973 as the exact year the floor fell out from under the American Republic.
If we connect this back to the overarching theme of civic duty and skin in the game, Riker argues that the abolition of the U.S. military draft in 1973 was a catastrophic turning point in American history.
Why specifically the draft?
Before 1973, young men understood that if they voted for a hawkish politician who took the country into a foreign conflict, they might personally receive a letter in the mail forcing them to go fight, bleed, and potentially die in that war. The draft created a visceral, inescapable, life-or-death link between political voice and personal sacrifice.
And when it ended?
When the draft ended, and we transitioned to an all-volunteer force, he argues we descended into what he calls spectator citizenship.
And look at the results he points out today. He cites Pentagon data showing that 77% of American youth between the ages of 17 and 24 are currently physically, mentally, or legally unfit for military service.
77%.
They are either obese, on psychiatric medication, or have criminal records. Riker says this isn't just a military recruiting crisis, it's a civilization on life support. To prove his point, he compares the United States to Israel.
The Israeli comparison is vital to his framework. In Israel, there is roughly 92% conscription among the eligible Jewish citizen population. Almost everyone serves. Consequently, the voter turnout among veterans is staggering around 87%.
Because they're invested?
Because nearly the entire voting bloc has worn the uniform, Riker argues. They vote pragmatically for national survival because they intimately know the brutal cost of war. He contrasts this robust civic culture with nations like Norway and Sweden.
Right. What happened in Scandinavia?
During the post-Cold War era of the 1990s and 2000s, both Norway and Sweden effectively abolished mandatory conscription, believing that the era of state-on-state warfare was over, replaced by a utopian end-of-history peace.
And Riker says that was a mistake.
He argues that removing this duty caused their defense cultures to completely collapse. They prioritized welfare spending over defense to such an extreme degree that, during recent geopolitical tensions, Norway realized it lacked the basic munitions to defend its borders and had to beg Germany for artillery shells.
They had to beg for ammo.
The reality check was so severe that both nations have recently been forced to reinstate forms of mandatory conscription.
To bring this back down to the individual level, Riker uses an anecdote of a combat veteran living next door to a TikTok influencer. The influencer, who produces shallow digital content, pays maybe $1,200 a year in taxes, has never served in the military, yet continuously votes for politicians who pledge to defund the military and open the borders.
And the veteran.
The veteran, who has literally bled for the country, lost friends in combat, and pays significantly more in income and property taxes, has to sit back and watch his profound personal sacrifice be politically diluted and outvoted by someone with absolutely zero skin in the game. Riker calls this dynamic treason by ballot.
Furthermore, he introduces a fascinating and highly controversial macroeconomic concept called temporal sabotage. This is an argument specifically aimed at childless voters, dealing with the concept of time horizons in economics and policy planning.
Unpack that for us. What does a macroeconomic time horizon have to do with whether or not you have kids?
In economics, your time horizon dictates how far into the future you are willing to plan and invest. Riker argues that people with no biological investment in the future, meaning they have no children or grandchildren, vote recklessly on long-term policies.
Because they won't be around to see the consequences.
If you are casting a vote on national energy policy, defense spending, or managing a $35 trillion national debt for the year 2050, but you have no biological descendants who will inherit that world, Riker asserts that your time horizon naturally shrinks to the length of your own lifespan.
You treat the future as a performative fiction.
You are planning for the end of the world, not the continuation of it.
So he's saying that without children, voters naturally prioritize instant gratification.
Exactly. This is a crucial piece of his demographic analysis. He claims that voters without children, particularly focusing on the voting patterns of childless women under 40, vote based on short-term emotional validation and immediate social status rather than intergenerational continuity.
Because they don't have that biological stake.
Because they don't have a biological stake in what happens a century from now, he argues they prioritize immediate financial subsidies, environmental extremism that cripples industry today, and ideological purity over long-term pragmatic sustainability.
Okay, so Riker has diagnosed the disease from every possible angle, economically, psychologically, militarily, and demographically. What is his cure? If the system is this misaligned, what is he actually proposing we do about it? In Section 6, we reach the absolute climax of his book, his proposed legislative framework, which he calls the Sanity Act.
The Sanity Act is Riker's radical, uncompromising blueprint for restructuring Western democracy. It explicitly and unapologetically rejects the foundational premise of universal suffrage. In his framework, voting is not an inherent human right. It is a profound responsibility that must be earned. The Act proposes that voting rights must be tied exclusively to verified, quantifiable contribution to the state.
Walk us through the specific mechanics of how this would actually work. Who gets to vote under the Sanity Act?
The mechanics are extremely precise. To earn the franchise, the right to vote a citizen must complete one of two pathways. The first pathway is completing a minimum of 2 years in active military service or a rigorous civil service equivalent, such as the Border Patrol, Heavy Infrastructure Corps, or Emergency Response.
Yeah, and if they don't do that.
If you are unwilling or physically unable to serve, the second pathway requires you to earn the vote by maintaining a net positive tax contribution for 10 consecutive years. Meaning, for a decade, you must pay more into the system than you take out.
And what happens if you dip below that?
Crucially, under this act, if you fall into the category of a net consumer of state resources, if you rely on welfare, housing subsidies, or prolonged unemployment, your voting rights are immediately suspended and remain suspended until you re-enter the workforce and become a net contributor again.
And he doesn't stop at just filtering the voter base. He completely changes how votes are counted. He proposes a system of vote weighting. Under the Sanity Act, you get one vote for every $10,000 in lifetime net tax contribution you make to the state.
It's pure mathematics to him.
So a guy who has paid $200,000 in net taxes over his career doesn't just get one vote, he gets 20 votes. Conversely, a woman who has consumed $80,000 more in state benefits over her lifetime than she has paid in taxes gets 0 votes. When critics inevitably attack this as misogynistic or classist, Riker's blunt response in the text is, it's not misogyny, it's math.
Furthermore, the Sanity Act includes mechanisms he calls cognitive threshold tests and nonfiction filters.
This is where it sounds almost dystopian to modern ears. What is a nonfiction filter?
Before casting a ballot, citizens would have to pass an exam demonstrating basic proficiency in logic, statistics, and causal reasoning, essentially reinstating the trivium at the ballot box. Furthermore, they must legally affirm that fictional entities do not possess political rights.
Wait, fictional entities?
To justify this bizarre-sounding requirement, Riker cites a highly publicized incident at Evergreen State College in Washington. A student activist group successfully gathered over 300 signatures from registered voting-age students petitioning the local government to grant literal voting rights to squirrels and other local wildlife, arguing for their ecological agency.
You have got to be kidding me.
Riker uses this anecdote to assert that the current electorate is plagued by magical thinking and profound developmental arrested development. He argues that a cognitive threshold is legally required to weed out absolute delusion before it can dictate state policy.
If the Sanity Act is his hardline, almost draconian legislative fix, he also offers a slightly more realistic technological alternative. He spends a significant portion of the final chapter praising the digital sovereignty of Estonia. How does a tiny Baltic nation fit into this grand theory of civilizational collapse?
Riker views Estonia not just as a country, but as a proof of concept for a modern, accountable, mathematically sound state. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia had to rebuild its government from scratch. Today, they run 99% of their government services online via a secure, blockchain-like infrastructure.
Everything is tracked.
Citizens use a mandatory, highly secure digital ID card that tracks absolutely everything: their tax history, their medical records, their voting, and their civic contributions.
And he highlights a specific experiment they ran in the capital, Tallinn.
Yes. He details a municipal experiment in Tallinn where the city managed public housing wait lists using a civic score. This score was dynamically calculated based on a citizen's tax history, their documented volunteer hours, and whether they had completed emergency response training.
Rewarding contribution.
The algorithm prioritized those who contributed to the community over those who merely existed in it. The result: the waitlist for public housing dropped by 68%. Riker points out that the system actively rewarded responsibility and civic duty over emotional victim narratives. He believes Estonia proves that when a system enforces total transparency, removes bureaucratic middle managers, and mathematically links social privileges directly to civic duties, corruption vanishes and national productivity soars.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered a massive amount of ground today. Riker's book, Franchise Firewalls Keep Welfare Queens Out of the Ballot Box, provides a deeply controversial, unapologetic, and meticulously data-backed framework. Whether his conclusions infuriate you or validate what you've been observing, his central thesis is clear. He is arguing that our institutions were fundamentally transformed and, in his view, broken the exact moment we removed the requirement of duty and sacrifice from the right to vote. He believes that giving equal political power to those who consume wealth and those who create wealth is not a triumph of human rights, but a guarantee of civilizational collapse.
Indeed. And as we conclude our analysis of his text, I want to leave you with a final, extrapolative thought that builds on Riker's core premises. If Western democracies continue on this current trajectory, steadily expanding the franchise and political power to net consumers, while simultaneously advancing AI and robotics technology that will eventually automate the labor of the remaining net producers, we face a profound and unprecedented paradox.
The AI factor.
Will the concept of the state eventually become nothing more than a highly advanced AI-managed wealth extraction machine designed solely to placate a dependent majority? And if so, where does the producing man fit into a society that no longer requires his physical labor to function, but still absolutely demands his taxes to sustain the dependents who outvote him?
That is a very heavy, incredibly complex question to chew on, and exactly the kind of critical thinking this book demands. And that wraps up our ultra-long deep dive for today. Once again, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these deep explorations. If you want to dive into the raw data, the historical footnotes, and the full arguments we discussed today, you absolutely need to check out Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy Franchise Firewalls Keep Welfare Queens Out of the Ballot Box.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest essays.
We are not here to tell you what to think, but we are dedicated to giving you the tools, the context, and the history to understand the conversation. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.